Okay, so we are picking up where the previous video left off here. So folks at home, this is starting with LBJ. So the last one was JFK. This is LBJ. For those of you that are in person, you'll have to catch up later, but you're choosing to go with LBJ and Nixon today, so let's get started. All right, so you have to understand that JFK, John F. Kennedy, and I said in the previous class, youngest president we ever elected, all right? And when you walked in, I had the term WASP on the board, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. We've talked about that before. Every president, every single one, 1 through 34, up to JFK's election, was a WASP, okay? White, Northern European, Protestant. What made JFK different?
He was Catholic.
He was Catholic. So he was our first minority president, and it's not even something that we would traditionally call a minority. Okay? Even so, he's different because he's the youngest we ever elected at 43 years of age. Now, who was the youngest president ever?
George Washington.
Nice try, but no. He only took over as a vice president for a president that died, tragically.
Give us a hint.
I know who you're talking about, but I can't get
His political operative, Mark Hanna, said, and I quote, "The damn cowboy's president now." He didn't like this vice president. He was nervous. He thought he was kind of a trigger-happy, crazy guy. He was a bigger guy. He wasn't the fattest. The fattest president we ever had was Taft. He was in the Army.
What is his name?
He wasn't a general.
I literally know who you're talking about, but I cannot.
Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was 42 years of age.
That's not what I thought.
Theodore Roosevelt was 42 years of age. He took over when McKinley was shot and killed. Okay? Because he was a cowboy for a couple of years. I think I told this class that he had the worst Valentine's Day of any American. His wife died in childbirth the same day that his mother did. It was Valentine's Day, 1884.
Did he wear spurs?
Okay? He went out west because he went nuts. You know, his daughter was born. He named her Alice, which was his first wife's name.
Oh, yeah.
Handed off Alice to his sister, said, "I can't deal with this," and went out to South Dakota for 2 years to be a cowboy.
Did he wear spurs?
He legitimately had a mental breakdown.
Oh, I gotta-
And I'm sure he wore spurs, Carol.
Thanks for answering.
People at home, this is what I have to deal with every day. So, needless to say, Roosevelt's the youngest we ever had at 42. So when you think youthful, presidency is not one of them, okay? Think about, like, you guys are probably too young, obviously, when Obama got elected, but Obama was fairly young for the job. So was George W. Bush. We followed it up with electing literally the oldest presidents we've ever elected, the last two. Trump was the oldest, then we elected Biden, who is now the oldest. Okay? Oldest we ever elected. Okay? So, needless to say, age has changed a little bit, but think about, if you remember from Truman and Eisenhower, when you were researching those two, at least theoretically, Truman and Eisenhower, if you looked at pictures of them, the first words you would use if I was to say, "Hey, describe them for me," last bell was like old. The first one, old and white. Okay? Kennedy, young. Okay? He comes in with this mindset of a new frontier, the youth movement, you know, the next generation of Americans. Okay? He then gets killed November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, and the old guy from Texas takes over. Okay? LBJ is a holdover from the New Deal era. He was in Congress when FDR was pushing through the New Deal legislation. So you're talking about old guard now taking over for the youth. Young people don't like it when their youth is replaced with somebody old. Think about how Obama supporters felt when Donald Trump took the oath of office. Okay? And that wasn't near as tragic as, hey, the previous president died and the vice president took over. Okay? To LBJ's credit, as he's taking the oath of office, and I say, and if you watch the video, you'll get this pointed out, he's standing next to Jackie Kennedy. Okay? Now think about the day she's had. She's been in the back of a limousine, okay, a convertible, if you will, that she watched her husband get shot, both in the neck and head, right next to her. Parts of his brain actually leaked out onto her dress. Her dress has brain matter and blood all over it.
How does she not have a mental breakdown?
She doesn't have a change of clothes, so she is literally standing in the dress that still has his blood and all kinds of other stuff on her. All right? She's on Air Force One witnessing this because they felt like this was the only way for America to kind of move on a little bit and see continuity, that Jackie Kennedy is supporting the transfer of government from her dead husband, whose body is literally in the next compartment on the plane. Okay? Flying back to D.C., it's one of the most dark, disturbing images in American history. Her husband is literally 20 feet away in a casket. Okay? We have to give Jackie Kennedy a lot of credit. Okay? She was either in shock, showed a tremendous amount of grace, or a little bit of both to do this. Okay? Strength of character, without question. She witnesses the oath of office being administered. LBJ takes over. Now, America immediately looks at this and says, is this guy going to be a return to the FDR days, or is this guy going to be a continuation of what JFK was trying to do? To LBJ's credit, he looks at the situation and says, this is not my presidency. This is JFK's presidency. He still has a year left. His vision's going to be my vision. So he pushes through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Think of how much he's maybe sacrificing here. He is a white man from Texas who is pushing through civil rights legislation. LBJ personally is not someone that believes in equality between the races. But he knew that that was the goal of JFK, and he followed through with that. He basically said the principles that I share is not what JFK was wanting. That's not his vision. That was not his intended purpose. They've come too far for me to be the one that stands in the way. So to LBJ's credit, he continued something that went against his personal beliefs. Okay? Now, was he a racist bastard? By today's standards, without question. Back then, he was probably a little bit more on the fence, at least when it came from Texas. He wasn't out and out racist to people. Okay? He wasn't one of those people that you see in movies that is, using derogatory language or anything like that. So he would have been considered to be somewhat liberal on it, at least some wiggle room, but he certainly wasn't somebody that was going to, shake hands with MLK and say, man, you're the greatest, He found him to be rather annoying. Okay? We now know that because of audio leaks from the White House and from phone calls. Okay? When you guys all have Ficker next year, if you're lucky enough to have Ficker, he'll share with you some of those phone calls. Not only are some of them super inappropriate, they borderline crazy. You will actually find out just how big Johnson's Johnson is. Because he actually has a phone call with his tailor complaining about how bunchy something is. Johnson he's very, look, Johnson is one of the most inappropriate people to ever be in the White House. We make fun of Trump, but Johnson literally spends the next 3 years complaining to the White House plumbers that his shower is not good enough. He wants more water pressure. Okay? When Nixon takes over in the White House, he almost kills himself taking a shower because when he turns it on, it knocks him down. Okay? Johnson literally liked to have his shower to where his skin was beet red. He would take like an hour-long shower in what is considered a fire hose. Okay? So they had to actually back off the water pressure for Nixon and the next presidents because it was just too much. Johnson also, no joke, he's out with a reporter at his Texas ranch. He's kind of taking care of some horses. One of the horses tries to kick him. He punches the horse in the face. The reporter is appalled and he goes, well, that's how you deal with him. He ain't going to kick me again. That's just how he is. He's just different. He used to have staff meetings in his personal bathroom in the White House. He would be sitting on the throne, as he called it, with a newspaper, and they would have to sit in there on the bathtub, like the lip of the bathtub, and have a meeting while he was taking care of some business. Number one was taking care of number two, and everybody had to sit there and just deal with it. If you didn't, you got fired. So LBJ is not JFK by any stretch of the imagination. Still, he pushes through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, what does it do? It basically takes away all of the restrictions that Brown versus Board of Education had started to kind of pick away at. If you remember, in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education said that Jim Crow laws were not okay. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and separate but equal. It said separate and equal cannot be. You have to be equal across the board, and integration was the key. So Brown versus the Board of Education happens in 54. In 64, they're still trying to get there. There's still Jim Crow laws kind of floating around. The Civil Rights Act of 64 strikes those down. It basically enforces the 14th Amendment, saying that equal protection under the law and equal rights were the goal of the 14th Amendment, and that race would not interfere with that. To Johnson's credit, he takes it a step farther the next year and says in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that you can't have literacy tests, you can't use things like poll taxes to limit African American or anybody else voting rights, especially in a place like the South. Okay, so it basically allows for what Lincoln had been preaching about in 1865. They finally get around to it in 1965. Takes 100 years, but they finally kind of get there. Okay? Are we still fighting over this stuff? Absolutely. If you've been paying attention to the news, that's what the Georgia Voting Act that they just passed is all about. That's what they're arguing. Does it limit access to voting for specific groups of people? If you ask the Democrats and Stacey Abrams, absolutely it does. If you ask the Republicans, they're just trying to make sure their voting is equitable across the board as best they can. They've been arguing about it since they passed it. They will continue to argue it because it all comes back to this stuff right here, okay? Now, Johnson is not done. He wants to continue, and look, you have to understand that Lyndon Baines Johnson, his hero is FDR, okay, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And what was his plan of action during the Great Depression called? The New Deal, right?
I was going to say that.
Lyndon Baines Johnson was a New Dealer. He believed the government should get involved and fix ills of society. So not surprisingly, he comes along with a program called the Great Society. He wants for there to be an end to childhood hunger. You know, he eventually calls it the War on Poverty, if you go down there, War on Poverty. Okay? He puts in place a number of different educational programs. He basically puts in place what is today known as Medicare and Medicaid, which for the most part is health care for elderly people inside the United States. It's just basically taking the New Deal and updating it, okay? Trying to add on some new programs. It basically formulates the modern day welfare state, okay? So if you think about the classic stuff, the subsidized housing, the food stamps, the welfare checks, unemployment insurance, a lot of that stuff has its roots in the Great Society programs. As with most big, huge programs by the United States government, what ends up happening, we put a bunch of money into the program and some less than reputable people are running it. Where does the money go? It doesn't go to the people that is necessary. It goes to the pockets of businessmen and shady individuals, and so there's a lot of corruption, unfortunately. So as with most great ideas by these politicians, they're really good ideas, but it doesn't actually come to fruition, okay? So the Great Society ends up being kind of a great flop in the end, okay? Again, it's mostly because of bureaucrats, people that really aren't involved in it, that shouldn't be involved in it. And LBJ can be blamed for it because it's his administration, but is he personally responsible? No. In 1964, he runs up against the conservative Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater is a senator from Arizona who basically is given credit for the neoconservative movement. Neo means new, and this is like the new brand of conservatives. This is not Eisenhower. This is not, the Republican Party of the early 1900s. This is the new brand of the Republican Party. Somebody was asking earlier, when does the party switch? This is a big part of that, okay, Stauffer? Barry Goldwater is a big part of this switch, okay? He is a big piece to the Democrats becoming a little bit more liberal and the Republicans becoming a little bit more conservative, and the whites in the South switching to Republicans, the blacks in the South switching to the Democrats. Barry Goldwater basically has the conservative belief that the government that governs the best is the government that governs the least, okay? You've heard the terminology of keep the government out of fill in the blank. Keep the government out of my house. Keep the government out of my bedroom. Keep the government out of my bank account. That's conservative thought. The government should not come in and tell me what to do. Okay? That's Goldwater. Goldwater also very much on the side of, hey, if the states can handle it, then let the states handle it. The federal government doesn't need to do that. Well, of course, who's that going to appeal to? Southern states who had already tried to secede from the United States, who still had that Southern pride, Southern cause mentality. So not surprisingly, the whites in the South were drawn to that. Okay? Now, does that mean they all fall in line? No, this is a long process throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And in the 70s, you start to see the full shift of the political parties. Okay? It's not like there's one moment that, blacks immediately go, well, the hell with being a Republican, I'm going to be a Democrat. Keep in mind, Martin Luther King Jr. was a registered Republican all his life. Why? It was the party of Lincoln. Lincoln freed the slaves, therefore, a lot of African Americans in the South were registered Republicans. When did that switch? When they started hearing the rhetoric not really helping them. And not surprisingly, who's the one that's pushing through the legislation for civil rights? The Democrat, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So a lot of African Americans in the South started saying, well, look, the party of Lincoln isn't on my side. The party of Johnson is. I'm going to start voting Democrat. And the whites in the South started saying, that ain't my guy. He is turned against us. He's turned against his own kind. And when Nixon comes along kind of preaching the idea of Southern strategy, Southern way of life, they get drawn to Nixon. So that's kind of the general, the question you had earlier, when does the shift happen? The correct answer is over time. There's no one event that causes it. But this is kind of what the 60s does. It blends it to where you start seeing people switch sides. And sometimes entire states shifting. Okay? Now, again, Goldwater comes in with this conservative mentality. LBJ comes in with one of the most controversial ads of all time. In fact, if you guys have ever watched campaign commercials, I'm sure you've seen campaign commercials where you're like, wow, that's pretty negative, or man, that's pretty crazy. I would like to point out the LBJ Daisy ad. This is by far the most controversial.
Her bangs are choppy.
Oh God, I hate our network is so stupid.
Oh, choppy.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay, so this is an LBJ ad that he ran in 1964 against Barry Goldwater. Now, Goldwater had been running ads about how if you vote for LBJ, you're voting for corruption, you're voting for lawlessness, you're voting for rioting in the streets. So he had been somewhat negative.
So basically what just happened.
Okay? This, however, takes it to a whole new level. This only ran once. Okay? That's how powerful this ad was. It ran once, and that was it.
Powerful in a good way or bad way?
You'll see.
Either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson
I mean,
on
the
November
message
3rd.
is there, it's just a
The
little
stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So this was run prime time, one time, and it was during family programming. So the kids looked at the parents and went, what the heck was that? So the parents had to explain to the kids what a nuclear bomb was. Okay, then they went into work the next day and said, dear God, did you see the ad last night? And everybody was like, dude, if we vote for Goldwater, that's going to happen. because he was painting Goldwater as being this guy that was just going to press the button. Keep in mind, only 2 years earlier was the Cuban Missile Crisis, okay, where we were this close to nuclear war. What is LBJ saying? Hey, if Goldwater was president during that, we would have been blowing up cities. Vote for me or we all die, okay?
I mean, the message was.
Personally, I think the more upsetting ad, if I were Goldwater, would be,
Oh God.
Oh.
Oh God.
this one is bad.
We represent the majority of the people in Alabama who hate niggerism, Catholicism, Judaism, and all the isms of the whole world. So said Robert Creel of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. He also said, I like Barry Goldwater. He needs our help. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
That's like actually scary.
That's mostly paralysis speaking.
Okay, so keep in mind, LBJ during that is quoting Robert Creel, who was the leader of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan, talking about all the things that he hates. And then quoting him right after that, I like Barry Goldwater, he needs our help. The inference, of course, is that the Klan is for Barry Goldwater. If you vote for Barry Goldwater, are you going to be part of the Klan?
Nope.
Now, are there parts of the country that were like, yes. Absolutely. But the vast majority of the states were like, no. At no point are we the Klan.
He did win,
Okay.
right?
Johnson wins in a landslide.
Okay.
It's not even close. Now, here's the thing, though. Barry Goldwater is not a member of the Klan. Okay? Did he? And the reason that they painted him this way, he voted against civil rights legislation when he was a senator from Arizona. So everybody thought he was this racist, horrible human being. He came out in his memoirs and said, the reason I voted against it is I wanted the states to solve it because I felt like a federal government coming in and telling him, no, you're not going to do it, wasn't going to fix anything. Now, you may disagree with his rhetoric, but he's not necessarily wrong. The federal government going into Mississippi, did it make it better? It caused a lot of problems. There were people in the South saying, well, here come the Northerners telling us how to live our lives again. It caused a rise in Klan activity during the 60s. Okay? Keep in mind, a lot of people blamed the assassinations of MLK and other civil rights leaders like Medgar Evers on the federal authority coming in and kind of causing problems. Barry Goldwater said, wouldn't it be nice if we kind of put pressure on the governor of the state to fix the problem? If nothing, and that's the point.
Like, still
Go-
to say, like, nothing.
Keep in mind, are there governors of states who have mishandled the COVID stuff?
Yes.
Yeah.
And only because of politics, right?
Okay, Texas.
Okay? Look, again, elected officials, what Goldwater was saying is, we need to hold people accountable for not doing their job. We can't just go in and fix it. We have to put pressure on these people to do the right thing. So his thing was, I'm not voting against civil rights legislation because I'm racist. I'm voting against it because I don't think it's not the right way to go about it. Again, you don't have to agree with him. That's just his mentality. Now, the reason Goldwater matters is there is a young guy from California who's just getting into politics, who had been a lifelong Democrat, FDR supporter, who all of a sudden becomes a Republican and a Goldwater advocate. He's a young actor who had been in some B movies. He wasn't like a big name, but he had been in some movies people knew. Anybody know who that person was?
Leo. Young Leo?
Put it on your wall.
Do realize he's important.
He's important.
Say it loud, say it proud.
Ronald Reagan.
It's Ronald Reagan.
He was in the B movie.
Wait, what movie?
Dear God.
I thought he was too. Wait.
Not a stupid cartoon by Jerry Seinfeld.
It's not stupid.
B movies used to be, and then I should explain that. B movies
You
used to
should.
be the second movie of a showing, meaning you guys have all been in the movies where they do the coming attractions and then they say, and here's our feature presentation. Back in the day, back in the day when your grandparents were going to the movies, it used to be that you would watch maybe a newsreel footage where they would kind of give you like what's happening in the world. They would give you coming attractions, they'd give you a couple of previews, Then they would give you the feature presentation. So and you might even have some cartoons prior to it, like Looney Tunes and stuff. Ladies, what are we doing?
Looking at young Ronald Reagan.
They're talking about Ronald Reagan.
Is he hot? When he was young.
A lot of people thought he was a very good-looking guy.
I know. JFK was. Woo.
Wow, so useful.
So, Ronald Reagan had been in what are known as B movies. This was, you got done with the feature presentation, and they would have kind of a second string movie. They'd have something that, you know, isn't as good, but just, you know, if you want to stick around and watch another movie, it'll be running anyway. Okay? That was considered the B movie. Okay? He was in those second string. The best way I can explain it now is, let's say you go to see an Avengers movie. You get done and they're like, all right, now we're going to show you a Hallmark movie.
So it's kind of like.
It's like, you know, we
Yeah,
made a
it's
movie.
like the
It's
holiday.
okay.
So it's kind of like driving to like they show you like a big. movie.
Correct.
The double
And
feature.
the double feature, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay? So he was in a lot of those movies. Okay?
That's tough.
And think about how many, you know, Lifetime movies. Like the guy who played Superman years ago, a guy named Dean Cain, is in like every Lifetime movie, or so is Mario Lopez. Like, imagine if one of those guys decided, you know what, I'm going to run for Congress. And there are people, like Mario Lopez has said he's interested in going into politics, so is Dean Cain for that matter. Okay?
Who are these people?
Again, you have Google.
You have
Say
it
the
open.
name so fast.
You have it open, ma'am.
Oh, you know what, Carol, you might be the laziest person I know.
I can't spell people's names.
Wasn't he on like Saved by the Bell or something?
No, don't even-
Dean Winchester.
That's Dean Cain.
Oh, ew.
What?
Okay? He's been in a bunch of what would be considered B movies. You know, Mario Lopez, yes, he was in Saved by the Bell. Good old AC Slater, you know? All
Looks
right.
like he got Botox.
Yeah, I'm not
Oh,
seeing
dude.
any good ones.
Did he have
So
Botox?
needless to say, Ronald Reagan comes out in support, full support for Barry Goldwater. All right? And he becomes very interested in his mentality, his conservative cause. It's not a surprise that when Ronald Reagan runs for the presidency in 1980 after being the governor of California, and a fairly successful one at that he runs on Goldwater principles and wins. Basically, the message is Goldwater was right, it's just he was 16 years too soon. Okay? So in 64, it scared the living bejesus out of people. In 1980, that's exactly what we need. Law and order, tough on Soviet Union, you know, really go after these guys. It was just, again, different time period, okay? So Reagan is the product of Barry Goldwater, if you will. Now another name up there, Thurgood Marshall. I'm currently reading a book on Thurgood Marshall. I find him fascinating. Thurgood Marshall is your first African American on the Supreme Court, but he's so much more than that. Too many times we see like that as a footnote in your American history books. Here's why Thurgood Marshall matters. Thurgood Marshall worked as a lawyer for the NAACP, okay? And he worked as a lawyer for the NAACP in the late 1940s, early 1950s. He's the guy that is the lead counsel in a Supreme Court case called Shelley versus Kramer, okay? Shelley versus Kramer was on your Truman worksheet, by the way. Shelley versus Kramer was about fair housing, okay? That you could not, if I'm a landowner, if I'm a landlord, and you walk in to get an apartment, I cannot deny you the opportunity to live there based upon the color of your skin. Okay? Shelley versus Kramer said, no, equal housing needs to be available. I can't just deny you based upon your race, your color, your creed, your ethnicity, your gender. I can't do that. Okay? So that was a Supreme Court case that he won. Okay? He also won a number of acquittals of African Americans who had been wrongfully accused of murder, wrongfully accused of rape. He's the lead counsel on the Brown versus the Board of Education trial. He is a very successful lawyer. When he is elevated in 1968 to the Supreme Court to become the first African American justice on the Supreme Court, there are a number of people who said, what the hell took so long? Okay, because this guy was, you know, we talk about who should be judges. He had a pretty darn good list of accomplishments. He's one of the most successful lawyers in American history. Okay? And keep in mind, the book I'm reading right now makes it very clear. He is always instant, like seconds away from death, because he goes down into these southern communities to represent these people at trial. And when he gets them acquitted, they have to escort him out of town out of fear that the local boys aren't going to show up and string him up. okay? Just imagine you're just there to do your job and you gotta run out of town, get on the train or get in a truck and get the heck out of Dodge because there's a posse coming to try and lynch you, okay? This guy lived a very, very dangerous life, okay? So needless to say, Thurgood Marshall, very important guy to history when you're talking about the civil rights movement, and he tends to get passed by, okay? They finally get him on the Supreme Court in the late 1960s. Weirdly enough, he's replaced by another African American on the Supreme Court, the one that is currently on the Supreme Court, a man by the name of Clarence Thomas, who does not agree with Thurgood Marshall's stance. Thurgood Marshall tends to be very liberal. Clarence Thomas is probably one of the most conservative people on the Supreme Court. Okay, so they kind of went opposite directions when it came to mentality. Okay, I said before, the War on Poverty is a branch of the Great Society. This was probably the most corrupt version of the Great Society because it just, the idea was there that we were going to feed people that didn't have the resources, you know, and lived in communities that were poor or poverty-stricken, and you know, that was kind of our goal. Unfortunately, a lot of the money got diverted to other people and other causes that really weren't worthy, okay? The War on Poverty is very similar to the Freedmen's Bureau. I say that because this could be a DBQ or LEQ this year for those of you taking the AP exam, trying to compare time periods where government programs didn't work. They were meant to help people but didn't work. If you are reviewing, I definitely would look over the Freedmen's Bureau, which was designed to help African Americans in the South after the Civil War, and it failed mightily. They were supposed to get education and economic opportunities, and it didn't work because, again, there were businessmen who were, you know, taking money out of the program and lining their own pockets. Same thing happened with the War on Poverty. That wasn't necessarily racial as much as it was a real crime against poor people inside the United States. The Watts riots. The Watts riots happened in the 1960s in LA. These were probably the worst riots in America, in American history. We have a number, unfortunately, of occasions where riots have become bloody affairs and very violent. And look, last summer wasn't the best summer we've ever had, okay? Especially if you lived in Minneapolis and some of these other cities. I mean, heck, Columbus and Cincinnati had their problems too, okay? Plenty of damage, but Watts riots wasn't just damage, it was people getting shot, people getting killed, you know, riots getting out of control, and LA's had some of our worst riots. They had riots in the 60s in Watts, which was a poor neighborhood, predominantly African American, all because of civil rights violations and issues, and not surprisingly, issues with police. 1991, same deal, Rodney King, issues with police and police brutality. We had riots in 1991 in LA as well. And of course, last summer, we had riots in numerous places. The most vocal of which was, of course, you know, up in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And prior to that, we had problems in Ferguson. We had problems in Baltimore. We've had some issues for the past few years, to say the least. One of the voices of reason during this was a guy named Robert F. Kennedy. Not surprisingly, he's part of the Kennedy clan. He's the brother of John F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy decides in 1968 he's going to run for the presidency because Lyndon Baines Johnson decides he's not going to run for the presidency. He surprises everyone because he's still eligible to run for another term. Okay, he served the last year of John F. Kennedy's term. He served his term out, and then he was going to transition over maybe for another term because he's still within, according to the 22nd Amendment, you're allowed 2 terms or 10 total years. Okay. LBJ's afforded the opportunity to run again because he'd only served for 5 years. If he won 4-year term, he would have gone for 9, still under the 10 years. Okay, that's their way of saying, hey, look, if you know the president dies or the president resigns, leaves office, we don't want you to get screwed if it's at the end of his term or something where you can't run again after that. Okay. So the actual limitation isn't just 2 terms; it's 2 terms or 10 years. Okay, LBJ could have ran again, but because Vietnam was so bad and not going very well, and because that whole issue was very supercharged, and because his Great Society programs weren't really working the way he wanted to, he thought it was best to kind of withdraw. Now, he also personally knew his heart was not good. He was going to have a heart attack. He had already had heart So he withdrew, and not surprisingly, 3 years later, he died. So had he won re-election, he would have died in office, most likely. Okay? So it's probably a good idea for him to withdraw. Robert F. Kennedy steps in and is the anti-Vietnam candidate. He's the one that's kind of preaching that he's going to end the war in Vietnam. And he gets people excited again because it's a young guy. He was part of JFK's administration. He was the Attorney General. He was a senator from New York. People liked him. And of course, women also liked him because he's a Kennedy. I don't know if you've ever seen Robert F. Kennedy.
Is he hot?
No, the ladies liked him.
The hot guy? Look up young.
The old young.
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 Young. That's ugly. Do
Young.
young. Please look up
Young.
He's
Tell me
ugly.
that's not him young, please.
Why do you look at me? I need
Okay.
to go to young, but young.
And of course,
His teeth
Look.
are blowing me off.
these are the three Kennedy brothers that survived to adulthood. Well, not just adulthood. The oldest actually was killed during World War II. That was the one that the older Kennedy, Joseph Kennedy, wanted to be president of the United States. His name was Jack. It's really kind of creepy. John F. Kennedy's nickname was Jack, okay, after his brother died. And it was because his dad kept calling him by the wrong name.
He just let him.
Just imagine if like your sibling passes away and they just keep calling you by that name because they can't deal with it,
It was ugly.
okay? So John F. Kennedy gets assassinated in 1963. Robert F. Kennedy is the middle brother, even though it's pictured awkwardly here.
So ugly.
And Edward Kennedy, who they called Ted, is in the middle. Okay?
Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy.
Yes. Remember, there's a fourth brother too, and there's a whole host of sisters too.
Oh, stop.
Okay.
Okay? One of them marries a guy named, and I kid you not, this is his actual name, Sergeant Schreiber.
Huh?
Okay? Sergeant Schreiber. Okay? He marries into the Kennedy family, marries one of the sisters. They have a child named Maria Shriver. She's on the news. You've seen her before. She was on like Dateline for a while and stuff like that. But she's better known as the former wife of Arnold Schwarzenegger. So weirdly enough, Arnold Schwarzenegger is part of the Kennedy family.
Of course he is.
Isn't Taylor Swift a part of the Kennedy family too?
I think it's spelled Shriver or whatever it is.
But do realize right now, I would not, for $1 million, want to be part of the Kennedy family.
Yeah, aren't they cursed?
There is a Kennedy curse. Okay?
Wasn't Marilyn Monroe part of that?
Well, she was messing around with John F. Kennedy.
Happy
John F.
birthday,
Kennedy, yeah.
Mr. President.
Now keep in mind, look, there was a lot of mystique around the Kennedys, and it's mostly around the fact that, John F. Kennedy, and even his son, for example, John F. Kennedy Jr., who was kind of like the most eligible bachelor for years, okay?
Oh wow. Oh wow.
He died in a plane crash with his wife, Carolyn
wow.
Bessette Kennedy, and his young son.
Oh.
He was a pilot. They were flying out to Martha's Vineyard, and the plane just disappeared. Okay? But the reason that people fell in love with the Kennedys was, pictures like this, where little John is walking with his dad around the White House, There's a famous photo of him underneath the desk in the White House while his dad's working.
Find it.
Oh, for God's sake.
What's his kid's name?
Stop.
So see, John F. Kennedy's working. John Jr. is underneath.
They call him John.
John. Okay. The only one remaining, because Jackie Kennedy died of cancer a couple decades ago now. The only one left is Caroline. Okay. But they've had a whole host of problems. They've had cousins die in skiing accidents. Ted Kennedy had a huge problem at a place called Chappaquiddick when he was thinking of running for the presidency in 1980. He was with a young intern, young lady. The car went off the road and into the water. He ran away from the car. Basically, he got out of the car and ran away from the scene. And she ended up drowning in the car.
So fun.
Okay? Never mind that he was married at the time.
And they say romance is dead.
Died at Chappaquiddick, unfortunately. Okay? And look, Ted Kennedy did not exactly age well.
Isn't Taylor Swift like a part of, did she date like a grandson or something?
Oh, probably she's dated half the world.
Okay, you're just mad because you didn't get a breakup hit, okay? So, I don't want to hear
So,
She has
look,
multiple
these were the young Kennedys and stuff. A lot of teeth.
Oh, wow.
But Ted did not exactly age well.
He looks like Heat Miser.
A little bit. Thanks, Carol. Good. So anyway, Robert F. Kennedy decides he's going to run for the presidency, ends up getting shot.
Surprise,
Okay.
Shawty!
He wins the California primary. He's walking through the hotel kitchen to leave, and one of the workers happened to have a gun, jumped out, shot him in the stomach. He ended up bleeding out, and we still to this day don't really know why the guy shot him, because he wasn't like, I hate the Kennedys or anything like that. He was trying to bring awareness to Palestine and their plight against Israel, which is just strange, okay?
Sorry.
But that's part of the curse. Go ahead.
Do you,
What?
do you think he would have won if he, lived?
Probably. But of course, he was running against a guy named Richard Nixon, and Nixon always managed to find ways to lose. This made the 1968, Kennedy's assassination made the 1968 Democratic National Convention an absolute zoo. They ended up settling on a candidate named Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. Okay? He was the vice president under LBJ, and widely considered to be a very capable guy, but because everybody was upset that it wasn't Kennedy, it was kind of like a letdown. Think about like the people that were like,
That's so sad.
they loved Obama as president, and then they followed it up with Hillary Clinton. There were people who were like, yeah, I mean, do we really want to go back to a Clinton? I mean, I don't want Trump, but not Clinton. That was kind of the whole thing. Oh, I don't want Nixon, but do I really have to vote for this guy? Is this the best we could do? I wanted a Kennedy, and this is the best I got.
Bernie Sanders.
So, sure enough, Democratic National Convention devolves into chaos in Chicago. There are protests everywhere against the Vietnam War. The police get involved, and of course, they start shooting off tear gas, arresting people, and then there's a riot. So, while Humphrey is taking the, giving his speech to talk about how he's going to be the next president of the United States and, his vision for America, they're split screening it where here's his speech, and on the other side, they're showing what's happening outside the convention center. It just absolutely looked like complete chaos. Richard Nixon runs on a law and order candidacy, and because of that, it pretty much ends the chance for the Democrats. What really kills them is what is known as the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, where LBJ keeps on saying, I think we're this close to victory, and then the North Vietnamese launch a counterattack against the United States forces and push us back. When we thought we were winning, all of a sudden on the news, it became very apparent we were not. And as LBJ famously says, if I can't win Walter Cronkite's approval, I've lost America. Walter Cronkite was the #1 news anchor back then, and Cronkite basically said, this war is lost. Once he said this war is lost, most Americans kind of tuned out at that point and said, you know what, we're not going to win this, I don't know why we're there. Which is why Vietnam is still very controversial. Yes, Carol?
Wait, wasn't Vietnam the war where, the veterans didn't get, the proper welcome home?
Correct.
Why didn't they get that? That's sad.
Because it was so controversial. People called them baby killers, people called them other nasty names, imperialists and other stuff, because they were just so mad about the situation. Now, as someone who has known people who are veterans of Vietnam and people who were protesting, they've calmed down since and seen some commonality, but it's still very supercharged in history.
I learned that on TikTok, that they didn't get a
Oh, good. You hear that at home? She learned it on TikTok.
Yep.
That's LBJ's presidency. We'll hit Nixon later in the week.